Well, thank you for coming, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Dr. Reiswick and his wife, thank you, and Kathy. It's really great to see so many friends that are interested in Alaska's history. So to explain the connection of the family connection with the Harper family, my great-grandmother, Margaret Mayo, was aunt to Walter Harper's mother. So she was the great aunt to Walter Harper, and my grandfather was first cousin to Walter Harper's mother. That's the family connection right there. And so growing up in Rampart, I would hear stories from my grandfather and my great aunts because I spent a lot of time with them. And they would talk about the family connection between the Harper family and the Mayo family. And my grandfather and all of his siblings, except for the last three sisters, along with the Harper children, they were all sent to a private boarding school outside of Berkeley. And I believe, but fortunately, the young men came back. All my grandfather and all of his brothers came back to Alaska along with the Harper sons. They came back, but some of the daughters did not return. They settled in California, and I remember my great aunt saying that it broke her heart when her daughters did not return. She sent three daughters out to this boarding school, and they did not return. And so she put her foot down and said, "You're not sending the last three daughters out." So consequently, they stayed in Rampart. But my great aunts and my grandfather would tell stories about the family connection. And I remember my Aunt Florence would say, Walter Harper was a very handsome young man. And as you could tell, he was. And they were really proud when he was taken under the tutelage of Archbishop Deacon Hudson Stuck. And I think he spent about 3 or 4 years up in Fort Yukon, and worked under the Archbishop, and learned a lot. And I remember reading a book about those years, and I'm extremely proud that Mary has taken this to a higher level and did a lot of research and wrote the book. And also I am very pleased to introduce Tom and Sarah Paddock. Tom is the great nephew of Walter Harper. Tom's mother, Connie Harper, was niece of Walter Harper's, and I visited Connie frequently when she lived here and when she was alive, and she told me she was a very entertaining storyteller, and she told me the first summer that she lived here in Juneau, and she was working for the BIA, and for a week she was renting a room on the flats, and she couldn't go to sleep. She was restless. She just could not sleep because she was afraid the rocks were going to be falling down from the mountains. And so after the end of the first week, her boss asked her, Connie, is there something wrong? You look very tired. And so Connie had to tell him, I can't sleep at night because those mountains worry me. And she was such an entertaining storyteller. And if Tom wouldn't mind, I'd like to have Tom, would you come up and say a few words? Okay. So this is Tom Paddock.
Hey, my name is Tom Paddock, and my mother Connie, as she told you, lived here, and we'd go up in summers to visit my grandmother in Fairbanks. We'd drive up the highway. And the stories I heard from my mother and my grandmother, that's about all I know about Walter. I never did know my grandfather because he passed way before I was even born. Both my grandfathers, on my mother's side and my father's side. But we'd go up to Fairbanks and we'd drive down to Nenana and wherever the roads would take us. We'd take my grandmother, Louise, and we'd go over here. When she'd come down to Southeast with us, all she could do was look around and just shake her head and just, all that's firewood. All those big trees, especially when you got down by Haines, look down at the Chilkat River and just say, all that firewood and all that fish. And boy, she could hardly wait. Then she got down to Juna here and she came and got my mother one day and she said, about the second day, she said, when are we going to move? I said, why? There's a flood coming. How do you know it's a flood? The water wasn't that high a little while ago, almost up to the house now. We better move. Our house is on West 7th Street. It's on piling. And so she got worried, and we had to tell her, no, it's just the tide coming in. Because, born and raised up in the river country, all he would see in the springtime was the floods, but didn't know about the tides when we come down here to Southeast. I didn't really get to know all of my cousins up north because when I was 14 years old, I started working in the construction field with my uncles and my dad. And I traveled with them all over. Being as the youngest, I was always in charge of, when we started towing the barge from here to there, I was always in the wheelhouse. My dad said, now, here's the course we go on, look at the compass. If your boat gets too close, just toot the horn. You'll see the big pile driver behind and I won't hit you. And I was just scared because I was a little guy. But it was a lot of fun. And we brought my cousin Mike Harper down to Southeast one summer, and we both started into the construction trade out there in the Herbert River Bridge and Eagle River Bridge. We too young to work with the crew, but they made us pull all the nails in the form lumber and stack it and get on the lowboy to take back to our shop here in town. Other than that, I really don't know much about Walter. I wish I did. I read his books, and then when they had the reenactment of the climb up to the hill, my granddaughter, she wanted to volunteer, but she was too young. She went up for an interview up in Anchorage there, but my cousin Johanna's boy was chosen to do the climb. And thank you. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Mary Ehrlander. She is a professor of history at University of Alaska Fairbanks and the director of Arctic and Northern Studies. Her previous books include Education Reform in the American States, Equal Educational Opportunity, Brown's Elusive Mandate, and she also translated and edited Albin Johnson's 17 Years in Alaska, A Depiction of Life Among the Indians of Yakutat. And her most recent book is Walter Harper, Alaska Native Son. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here, and I really want to thank the people who have so graciously hosted me and arranged for this series of events. It's very, very meaningful for me to be here with you, and this was an unexpected surprise and delight to get to meet both Tom and Tony this morning and to hear their remarks as well. I'm a Fairbanks girl, and born and raised in Fairbanks, and spent most of my life there, and you can see that's been quite a long time. But I'm embarrassed to say I've never been to Juneau before, and it's so beautiful here, and I've been struck just this morning, even with all the people I've met, I've been so struck at how what a strong sense of community I feel here, and also your connection to the Princess Sophia. And we don't have that connection in Fairbanks. People haven't really heard of the tragedy that much. On the other hand, there's a stronger connection with the Harper family, with a extended Harper family, and lots of cousins and people related to the Harpers there, even though Walter's story hadn't been well known at all until I feel really, really blessed to have discovered his story and to have been able to uncover it and publish it. So anyway, I really want to thank the people who have worked most closely with helping to arrange this, including Beth Weigel and Alyssa Borges at the Juneau Douglas City Museum, as well as Andy Hirsch, who picked me up last night, and then Claire Imamura here. So thank you so much for that, and also to my escort this morning and early afternoon, Damon Stubner, who has been very gracious and took me over to the cemetery. That was very meaningful to me to see Walter and Francis's grave there. So yes, I really appreciate this opportunity, and am always eager. I'm so eager to tell this story about Walter, to tell it personally, besides having told it in the book. And I so appreciate hearing from people who have read the story, and to hear that it has resonated with them, because I'm just convinced that Walter stands as a great role model to people the world over, but in particular to young Alaskans who look for someone to kind of maybe model their lives after, and someone they can really look up to and feel proud of. So I just I just want to kind of convey that. You'll be able to tell as I talk about him, and you can tell as you read the book, that this is a little bit of a love affair I've had with Walter Harper. My husband has been very indulgent of me and kind of accepted my obsession with Walter. So what I'll do then is just give you a little overview of his life, and then I will end with some comments about what the value I think that lies in this history, and then I'm very open to questions and comments from you. So Walter was the son of a very legendary figure in Alaska history, the Irish immigrant Arthur Harper, who came here as really a middle-aged man. He was middle-aged by the time he arrived in Alaska, and he was credited with having been the first person to really recognize the potential of the Alaska-Yukon gold field. And of course, at that time, the 141st parallel meant nothing, especially in geological terms, but also in terms of the indigenous peoples who lived here, because they migrated freely, naturally, over the border. Well, not long after he was here, he was traveling along the Yukon, he and his partners, and they came upon a gathering, a fish camp, where he met Jenny and her relatives, or Sintana. So Walter's mother was Sintana, or Jenny, as she was later called, and she was of Athabascan heritage. There is some thought that she may have had some Kobuk heritage too. But anyway, so the couple married when Jenny was just 14 years old and Arthur was 39. Now that would raise big alarm bells today, but it wasn't entirely unheard of back then. So over the years, the couple had 8 children. Over the next 20 or so years, they had 8 children, and they would move about rather frequently, establishing trading posts every time a new gold strike was made. So they lived in many different places. Walter was the youngest of 8 children. He was born at Nuku'aloya, which is now called Tanana. And when each of the children, Tony talked a little bit about this, the tradition for some children back then, but when each of the children reached school age, Arthur would send the child out to school outside. And this was against Jenny's objections, as I understand it, according to the family. Well, when Walter was about 2 or 2.5, his parents separated, and Jenny took Walter back to Tanana with her and raised him in the Athabascan tradition. And so that meant that Walter grew up, of course, speaking his mother's tongue, Tanana Athabascan, and he wandered quite freely through what we would call the wilderness. It was his homeland, of course, learning to hunt and fish at a very young age, and just developing quite a remarkable subsistence skill set. Well, when he was about 15 years old, the Episcopal Archdeacon Hudson Stuck came across the family at the family fish camp, and Walter kind of caught his eye. He saw potential in Walter, and so he convinced Jenny to allow him to take Walter to the mission school, St. Mark's Mission at Nenana, to get a Western education there. And so Jenny agreed to that. And thus began very shortly thereafter a relationship between Hudson Stuck and Walter that would grow into a really close father-son relationship. I want to mention something in the meantime about Hudson Stuck and the Episcopal Church and its approach to its mission work here in Alaska, because one of the sort of myths that I feel is important to dispel is that there was one story of missionary work in Alaska and that it was all bad. Actually, the stories were very much varied, and the church denominations had quite different approaches to native cultures and native languages, and then, of course, individual missionaries also were all individuals, and so they too had different approaches. Well, Hudson Stuck and the Episcopal Church, they were not at all interested in just simply assimilating Alaska Native peoples. There was a history of the Anglican Church and then the Episcopal Church, which is the daughter church of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, a history of having recorded Athabascan languages and translated the Bible and other religious readings into Athabascan. And rather than trying to turn the Athabascan people into copies of themselves, actually quite the opposite. The Episcopal missionaries really strongly urged Athabascans to remove themselves from the influences, as Hudson Stuck would put it, of those low-down white men who were up to no good, and encourage them to remain fluent in their languages, especially to maintain their subsistence skills. Now, of course, they did bring Christianity, and in other ways did bring change as well. But I just think it's important to point that out, that Hudson Stuck in particular was especially adamant that he really worked hard to try to protect Alaska Natives from the negative influences of mainstream Western culture and encourage them to maintain their subsistence skills. So Walter spoke almost no English when he entered St. Mark's, but he learned English quickly, and right away he impressed the kids there and the teachers with his subsistence skills, and he took to book learning quite quickly. And so after really just one academic year there, when Hudson Stuck would visit on occasion, and he noticed that Walter was making great strides, and so he offered Walter the position of being his trail companion, riverboat pilot in the summertime, and dog sled driver in the wintertime, and then being his interpreter as long as they were in Athabascan country where the language was either his own language or close enough to his own language that he could interpret. So Walter accepted that job. And according to Moses Cruikshank, who would later follow in Walter's footsteps and who also went to St. Mark's, all the boys wanted that position. It was a very coveted position to work with the Archdeacon, but the best student at the school got that job. So here, that's just a picture of Walter. That's the earliest picture that I have of Walter at St. Mark's Mission there. So Walter thus began Walter's life of being Hudson Stuck's, essentially his right-hand man, and they would travel about the interior of Alaska in summer, both summer and winter, on the river in summer and on the trails, the winter trails in the winter. And Walter, under the tutelage of his mentor, Hudson Stuck, he learned to navigate quite comfortably in Western society and in Episcopal church circles, and at the same time that he was continuing to hone his subsistence skills. So that was quite a remarkable thing. I'll come back to that just a little bit later when I talk about his experience outside at Mount Hermon School in Massachusetts. So here we see the territory that they covered. And I must have dropped my pointer somehow, but you know Alaska, there it is. You know Alaska geography. Okay, so they were headquartered at Fort Yukon here at the confluence of the Porcupine and Yukon River, just above the Arctic Circle, as you can see there. And so in summertime, they would first usually travel up the Yukon a bit to Eagle and then over the border, and then they would turn around and travel back down again, and they would come down to Tanana and then go up the Tanana River as far as they could. The most remote mission was at Tanana Crossing. That was established in 1912 or 13. And then they'd come back down the Tanana, and then they would come down to the Koyukuk, and they would travel up the Koyukuk to the Allakaket, where they had a very remote mission there. And then come on down. They even went out to, they would get out to Iditarod too, the mining camp there. For a few years, they also would go out there. So Walter was quite remarkable in that he seemed to be good at almost anything that he tried, and he picked up riverboat piloting, had really good mechanical skills. He picked up riverboat piloting right away and really impressed Hudson Stuck with that. And excuse me. You'll read, if you read the book, you'll read of some dramatic stories of his piloting the riverboat in emergency situations, and I know this because Hudson Stuck wrote about it, but it was just pretty stunning how he handled that boat. And then, of course, on the winter trail, I mean, he was just a really expert dog sled driver. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was that through their as their relationship matured over the years, it helped each of them really to achieve so much more than either would have on his own. So Walter matured into this self-confident young man with multiple skill sets. He had just sterling character. He had such a strong sense of himself, and this charismatic personality, like, you know, just really quite striking. And so he won admirers from all walks of life. Now, Hudson Stuck, I came to discover Walter helped him in turn to be more effective than he possibly could have in his own work, because Walter interpreted him, and Walter, in doing so, in many ways endorsed his message. And Walter had a lot of credibility among his own people, of course. And so in this way, Walter was a bridge between the Episcopal Church and his own people. And he allowed, well, besides, Hudson Stuck did not have the skill set, the physical skill set that Walter had, the subsistence skill set, but also Walter helped him as a go-between and liaison and bridge. And in that way, he helped Hudson Stuck to achieve far more than he could have on his own. So after they were on the winter trail for about 2 years together, Hudson Stuck's long-term vision of summiting Denali, which had not been successfully summited yet, came into focus. And he got permission from Bishop Rowe to take some time off. He raised the funds privately. That was not church funds that supported this at all. But he organized the expedition, Hudson Stuck did, and he gathered the funds for it, and he gathered a team together that would try the ascent. And so here we see the ascent team. At the center, we have the rugged outdoorsman, Harry Karstens, who was probably the most skilled white man in the territory, I think, in the interior anyway, in terms of his subsistence skill set. And he was just super strong physically, and on the ascent itself, he actually was the tactical team leader. So, and then of course Walter over to the right there, his figure is a little bit dark there, so you can't see him too well. But anyway, that's Walter on the right. It was a given that he would be on the ascent team, because by this time Hudson Stuck was completely dependent on him and truly admired the young man. And then over here we have Robert Tatum, who was a divinity student who was at the Tanana mission at the time. And then in the younger boys there, you have Johnny Fred on the right and Isaias George over here. And there had been kind of a competition at St. Mark's to see what two boys would be chosen to support the ascent team. And so Johnny and Isaias were chosen, and that filled out the expedition team. And Hudson Stuck later wrote that this was the best team that he ever could have assembled. Now, interestingly, he really admired Harry Karstens. He really, really did, and for very good reason. The guy was pretty remarkable. The feeling wasn't very mutual, though. Harry Karstens found Hudson Stuck annoying, abrasive, domineering, and he kind of was. I usually say, okay, I'm crazy about Hudson Stuck, but if I would have had to work with him every day, he probably would have got on my nerves too. But anyway, I still think he's a remarkable person. And so on the ascent, there was a huge amount of friction between those two. Hudson Stuck would later write of Walter in his book, Ascent of Denali. 21 years old and 6 feet tall, he took gleefully to high mountaineering, while his kindliness and invincible amiability endeared him to every member of the party. And indeed, he really was. Well, I'll get to that point about what I think that he was in just a second. But I wanted to mention that at the end of the climb, so they were successful, okay? And on June 7th, they summited with Walter in the lead, which I think was entirely fitting, because Denali was the central landmark in the Athabascan homeland. And But that wasn't the reason why Karstens put him in the lead. Karstens put him in the lead because Walter was the only one who was in good shape by that point. Everybody else was really suffering from altitude sickness problems. Where was I? So afterwards, Stuck got like 90% of the recognition for this whole climb. Sometimes Harry Karstens was just listed as his guide, which was absolutely not true. And Stuck didn't write that at all. Stuck was very fair to Harry Karstens in the publications that he made. But anyway, this was a misperception that lasted for quite a long time, that, oh yeah, it was Archdeacon Stuck, and yeah, those other people, we can't quite remember their names. Well, and just a few years ago, Tom Walker corrected the record in regards to Harry Karstens and his contributions to this success, and that was rightfully done, giving him the long overdue credit that he deserved. But I have to say that in my view, Walter was the linchpin. And the reason for this is that the co-leaders really, there was just incredible tension between them on the mountain. And Stuck didn't quite understand that the whole time. He didn't even understand how frustrated Karstens was with him, because he was never frustrated with Karstens. He was very happy for what he was doing. But so their personalities kind of clashed. But as the tensions rose, it was Walter's amiability and geniality that kind of, brought down the tensions, and his incredible strength and stoicism and cheerfulness moved the team forward, even as they were really, really struggling. And so as they got higher on the mountain, he assumed more and more of Stuck's burdens and chores, and it was he and Karstens who did the hardest work on the climb by far. It was they who chopped through the 3-mile-long northeast ridge that was just covered with boulders from an earthquake, huge earthquake, the year before. And so Karstens then, you may wonder, well, okay, sure, Stuck loved Walter and thought he was grand, but what did Karstens say about him? Well, it turns out that Karstens had a lot to say about Walter too. And he wrote to his good friend, the naturalist Charles Sheldon, "The deacon's boy Walter was a good one. 21 years old, strong, fearless, and fine and lovable disposition as I ever saw in a man. He was my main standby." These may have been the only two things that Hudson Stuck and Karstens agreed on after that climb. But here we have the evidence. So I really do feel, and I've talked to mountaineers. I'm not a mountaineer at all myself, but I've heard from many perspectives just how challenging it is on expeditions like this, and that personalities and dynamics, personal dynamics, can mean so much in the success or the failure of an expedition. And so I really think that Walter's combination of incredible strength and stoicism and his just general good cheer and really he had non-confrontation was a big part of who he was. So I really do, I'm not giving him all the credit at all. I give each of the team members credit, but I really do think, had it not been for Walter, they could not have succeeded. So after the expedition then, in the fall of 1913, as they had planned, Walter and Hudson Stuck traveled outside to Mount Hermon in northwest Massachusetts. And there, Walter enrolled in Mount Hermon School for Boys. It was a Christian-based school that had, by this time, built a strong reputation for doing well by Native American students. Its students were not primarily Native Americans, but they were very diverse, racially, ethnically, and even internationally. And the most well-known evangelist in the country at the time, Dwight Moody, had founded the school and a sister school for girls in the same area. And so by the time Walter entered the school, it had developed a strong reputation for providing a good education for Native American students and preparing them to return to their communities, remaining still assimilated and immersed in their own communities, but having gotten a Western education, so then they could be liaisons or bridges between their communities and the broader society. So they prepared them for going into the professions. And this was quite a contrast to the standard industrial schools of the time that were really working on assimilating Native American students and trying to have them not speak their own languages anymore, and put very bluntly, in some terms, to kill the Indian in the man, right? So Mount Hermon was quite the opposite of that. Now, Walter did struggle when he was at Mount Hermon. He started off doing quite well, and he had a number of remarkable experiences back there that were pretty cool. But he missed home so much. He missed hunting season, and he wrote to his sisters that he wished he would have taken some memorabilia from home and things like that. And over time, he started to struggle more academically because, after all, he'd only had 1 year of formal schooling at St. Mark's. And then, I forgot to mention that Hudson Stuck would tutor him in the evenings. So all day long, they'd be on the trail, whether it was, or on the river. But in the evenings, Hudson Stuck tutored him. But imagine, by the time he started at Mount Hermon, this is like a high school, prep school, and he'd had 1 year of formal schooling plus 2 to 3 years of tutoring by Hudson Stuck. So he really started to struggle in his geometry class, and he hated his English class because it was focused on debate. And he just that year when he started to flounder a little bit. He just hated debate, and he wrote to Hudson Stuck, and he said, "I don't like to argue," and he didn't. And that was in his Athabascan tradition, to not be confrontational. It was in his nature to smooth things over between others. So anyway, after 3 years, so he was there for 3 years, Hudson Stuck took him home again, and he resumed his role as Hudson Stuck's right-hand man. Let me just show you a couple more pictures here. Here's Northfield Mount Hermon today. It's a co-ed school, still Christian-based, in Northwest Massachusetts. And I just have to show you this because I just knew you'd want to see it. That was taken while he was back there at Mount Hermon. And I'm not certain, I have no way of knowing, but I suspect that this tie tack is the tie tack that Hudson Stuck had made at Tiffany's for all of the Ascent team members. And only Karsten survives today, but I think that must have been that tie tack with some granite from high up on the hill, not the summit, it wasn't from the summit, but it was high up on the mountain that Hudson Stuck brought down with him. So, oh my goodness, what a handsome man. And actually, all those Harpers were very handsome people. Yeah. They were. Okay, so Walter comes back to Alaska, and he's just happy as a clam now. He's out where he wants to be. He just really was out of his element back in Western Massachusetts. Here they are. This you may have seen this photograph online. But so he's back on the trail with Stuck and just doing really well again. Enjoying himself, back feeling comfortable like himself again. Okay, so the next big event that happens in his life is that this young woman, Frances Wells, who was a missionary nurse and trained at Deaconess Clara Carter's nursing school back in Philadelphia, arrived in Fort Yukon in early June of 1917 to serve as a missionary nurse there. And she very quickly fell in love with Alaska. She fell in love with her work. She fell in love with the Athabascan people. And you know what's coming next, right? Before very long, she fell in love with Walter Harper. And it was mutual. So now the problem was, they didn't get a lot of support right away Hudson Stuck was not having anything of it because Hudson Stuck had his mind on Walter's future. I forgot to mention that while Walter was at Mount Hermon, he had decided that he did want to become a medical missionary to serve in the homeland of his mother's to serve his mother's people. And by 1916, there was now a hospital at Fort Yukon, St. Stephen's Hospital. But the Episcopal Church had also built a hospital at Tanana, and it was never fully staffed. It never did get fully staffed. So anyway, Walter was going to be a medical missionary, and when he came home from Mount Hermon, they had an understanding that Stuck was going to continue to mentor Walter and tutor him. Walter just did a lot better studying right under the tutelage of Hudson Stuck than, in a classroom back east. So that was their plan, and he was going to go back outside in 1918. He was going to go back outside and get into college and then go on to medical school and come back to Alaska and serve as a medical missionary. Okay, so when this little romance started, Hudson Stuck was not happy about it because he didn't want anybody or anything to distract Walter from these plans. And so she was 4 years older than Walter, okay? And so Hudson Stuck told her she should just think of him as a brother, because by the time he got back from medical school and was ready to settle down and start a family, she'd probably be 40 years old. Well, Walter and Frances didn't accept that. And the medical missionary couple, Grafton or Happy Burke and his wife Clara, they weren't too keen on this either because they didn't want Frances to follow Walter outside to medical school, and then they would lose one of their best nurses. So nobody was super enthusiastic at first, even though they loved both Walter and Frances. Well, so one more big adventure would have to happen. One more big adventure did happen before the end of Walter's life, and that was that in this winter of 1718, Hudson Stuck had another long-held dream of traveling the Arctic coast of Alaska, because the Episcopal Church had a mission up here at Point Hope, and Hudson Stuck had never been there. And he was in the process of writing a book about the Episcopal missions throughout Alaska, and he refused to write about a topic that he didn't know firsthand. And so he really needed to get up there for that reason, but he just wanted to get up there too because he loved traveling throughout Alaska. So in early November of 1917, I don't want to move out of the camera range, but I have to for a second. Where do we have Fort Yukon? They started at Fort Yukon over here, traveled westward. Oh, thank you, Claire. Traveled westward over into Kobuk territory over here and out to Kotzebue, where they actually got to the Arctic coast then. And then they got the winter gear that they needed. It was going to be different gear, that they needed in Inupiaq territory. And so then they traveled up along the coast and got to Point Hope just in time for Christmas, as they had planned. A friend of theirs who was missionary up there now, William Thomas, was eagerly awaiting them. So they spent 6 weeks up there at Point Hope and had a grand old time. Then they carried on or continued all the way up to Point Barrow, where they stayed for 2 weeks, hosted by the well-known whaler and trader Charlie Brower. There, Walter made a great impression on him, too. Then they continued on all the way over to the demarcation point here, over to Herschel Island, where there was a Hudson's Bay outpost and little mission there. And then they went southward again, coming back into Athabascan territory in the interior, and headed back to Fort Yukon. It was a 2,500-mile, 6-month journey that nobody had done before, as far as I can tell, and I don't know that anyone has done it since. they always had to have an Eskimo guide or a Inupiaq guide as they were in Inupiaq territory, because they didn't know the region. Walter didn't know it, nor did Stuck, of course. And it's really dangerous up here along the coast, because if you're not Inupiaq, you can't tell the difference between the land and the ice. So you have to have a local guide. So they always did, and they traded off guides as they went along. Now, when they got into this area, though, they didn't need a guide anymore, and they were on their own again for the first time in quite a while. And it was here that Walter decided to share with Hudson Stuck, his mentor and father figure, a couple of decisions that he had made during the last weeks, apparently. And so he chose to do that by sharing with Stuck the diary that he had been keeping. And so Hudson Stuck read it from cover to cover and was impressed with Walter's ability to write very fluently and beautifully. And what he learned in reading the journal was these two decisions that Walter had made. One, he was going to join the Army Air Corps, because we were in the Great War at that point, and Walter wanted to do his bit over there. Well, naturally, Hudson Stuck wasn't too keen on that. He was proud of Walter for wanting to serve, but he, it was a twinge because he wanted him to go to medical school. And then the second thing he learned was that Walter and Frances were going to be married. And that was really hard for him to swallow at first too, because again, he didn't want Walter to get distracted. But here again, he was kind of proud of Walter, that he had won the heart of a fine gentlewoman or something like that, he wrote. So it took him a while to accept this. What was really striking was, up to this point, Walter was 25 now. He had celebrated his birthday up at Point Hope. He was 25 now, and for the first time in his life, he made these two decisions on his own without consulting with Hudson Stuck. They'd always made their decisions together about Walter's future. But now he was a man, and he made these two decisions on his own. And he asked for his mentor's support, not his permission. And I think that's quite remarkable. And it took Hudson Stuck a while to fully accept that and respect it, but he did. And that fall, on September 4, he married Frances and Walter in the little mission church at Fort Yukon. And I don't have a picture of them on their wedding day together. I like to think that this photograph is from their wedding day, because Walter looks so happy, and it's the most mature photograph that I have of him, and he is quite spruced up there. So I'm thinking it could have been his wedding day. So they were married, and they went on the most amazing Alaskan honeymoon trip you can imagine. Well, you probably can't imagine. So what they did was they went on a 3-week hunting trip for their honeymoon. They went to Walter's favorite hunting grounds, secret, I'm sure. I don't know where they were, but they were roughing it, as she called it, and had one famous time, as she later wrote to his sisters, just when they had returned to Fort Yukon and before they left on the ship. So she wrote that their luck had been fair. Walter had felled 2 caribou, 2 moose, 3 bears, and some small game. That was fair. You see, they were trying to supply the mission and hospital with the meat they would need for the whole winter. So, and he had had better hunting trips than that before. But she wrote to, it was either Jessie or Margaret, one of his 2 sisters, with whom he was very close. It was all miles of fun, and I venture to say that no 2 people could have gotten more real pleasure out of it than we did. So this picture of Walter on the right over there is one that she sent in a letter home to her family, and it's poor quality, and so I couldn't use it in the book, but I just love it because he looks so happy there, and she had sent that home to her father, and back in the day, you know, family members would circulate around letters. So she'd write a letter home that her father or her brother would read first, and then they'd circulate it. I found these letters. I can tell you that story later if you're interested. But anyway, so that picture was there, but it was poor quality, so I couldn't use it in the book. Anyway, they left Fort Yukon on the Alaska, the steamship the Alaska, on October 10, and their plan was to go out to Philadelphia and meet her family first, and then he was going to join the Air Corps and she was going to join the Red Cross, and they were going to do their bit over there. On the day they were leaving, Fort Yukon got a wire that an armistice was just about to be signed. And so they left lighthearted, knowing Walter was not going to be going off to war, and that he could go directly to college and then medical school. They boarded the Princess Sophia in Skagway on October 23rd. And you know the end of that story. Tragically, he was not able to have the legacy that I can certainly imagine he would have had he lived. I'll just share with you this note that, Walter's death was just a staggering blow to Hudson Stuck. The greatest sorrow he had ever known. And in fact, the missionary Frederick Drain said he never recovered from it. And in fact, Hudson Stuck died 2 years later. But by March of 1919, he had the strength to write to officials at Mount Hermon. And he wrote, "It has been a terrible blow to me. He was as a son to me. He had left behind him a sweet memory and the light of a bright example. He was at once the strongest and the gentlest, the cleanest and the most amiable youth I have ever known, the fine flower of the mixed blood. At the same time, he was the best shot, the best dog driver, the best hand at any sort of boat, from a birch bark canoe to a power launch, the most resourceful and capable man I have known in Alaska." And so, you know, I think I'll just say first that I feel so honored to have come across Walter Harper through Hudson Stuck's writings. This has been the most challenging and the most rewarding research I've done in my whole career. And it has really been it's actually hard for me to capture in words just how meaningful this has been for me. I really do think that he can stand as a role model the world over. I think that his story and what it has to offer transcends time and place. And so I feel sort of oddly grateful to Walter. I didn't ask him if I could share his story, but I would like to think that if I could ever have a conversation with him, that he might say, he'd probably say, "Oh, you're overdoing it." But I'd like to think that he'd say that, I kind of got it right. So it's been quite a journey for me. I do think that besides being an incredibly inspiring story, that this history has great value for a number of reasons. One, it sheds light on an era in Alaska history when Western immigrants and culture were inundating Alaska Native peoples and cultures. And the effects of these new belief systems and products and habits and diseases ranged from liberating to absolutely crushing. This history also illustrates Episcopal mission efforts to protect Native peoples from harm, even as they too introduce change. It demonstrates the capacity for human interaction to maximize the individual's potential. And finally, it exemplifies resilience, in a young man whose physical, mental, and moral excellence reflected acculturation in both Athabascan and Western lifeways. So thank you.